The annual general meeting of the Haldermoor Historical Society was, by tradition, an exercise in managed tedium. It took place in the Abbey's chilly scriptorium, where the air carried the faint, sweet scent of decaying paper and floor polish. The business of the day, minutes from the last meeting, the treasurer's lament over heating costs, the re-election of a committee whose members could only be removed by geological means, had been dispatched with the weary efficiency of a long-running play whose cast had forgotten the point of the plot. Inspector Pubright, attending in that most vulnerable of capacities, a private citizen, sat near the back. He found the proceedings a great comfort. They were a testament to the English conviction that if a thing was worth doing, it was worth doing in precisely the same way it had been done last year, preferably with the same biscuits. The main event, the reason for the unusually high turnout of 17 souls, was the unveiling of the Hemlock Bequest. Councillor Horace Ordway stood at the front, his chest puffed out like a pouter pigeon that had just spotted a particularly plump worm. He was a man for whom the sound of his own voice was a reassuring symphony. Before him, on a trestle table, sat a shape concealed beneath a drape of dark purple velvet. And so, he boomed, letting the words echo off the cold stone. We come to a truly historic moment, not just for the Society but for Chelmsbury itself. He paused for effect. The effect was largely lost on his audience, who were eyeing the tea urn with grim determination. Major Eustace Hemlock, Ordway continued, was a man of eclectic tastes, a traveller, a collector, and, in his final, generous act, a great benefactor. Next to him, the Society's curator, Mr. Alistair Appleby, shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He was a small, anxious man whose spectacles seemed permanently fogged by the effort of maintaining the Abbey's crumbling dignity. He clutched the pull cord of the velvet drape as if it were the handle of a parachute, and he was about to be pushed from a plane. "He has bequeathed to us," Ordway declared, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial rumble, "an artifact of singular importance, a relic from the mists of time. Dug from the jungles of the Yucatan, it is said to have belonged to the high priests of the Aztec emperor Moctezuma himself." A faint murmur went through the room. This was better than the treasurer's report. "I give you," Ordway announced, his voice rising to a crescendo, "the obsidian mirror of Quetzalcoatl." He nodded curtly at Mr. Appleby. With a trembling hand, the curator pulled the cord. The heavy velvet slid away with a soft shush. It revealed a mirror. It was a perfect circle of black glass, about a foot in diameter, set in a plain, dark wooden frame. It was also quite clearly brand new. The glass was flawlessly flat, its surface possessing the vacant, perfect sheen of a factory finish. The frame was machine-cut, its varnish still giving off a faint chemical tang. It was the sort of object one might find in the home furnishings aisle of a department store, positioned between a wicker magazine rack and a lamp shaped like a pineapple. For a full 10 seconds there was absolute silence. It was not a respectful silence. It was the profound, bottomless silence of 17 people simultaneously realizing that the much-anticipated climax was, in fact, a catastrophic anticlimax. Councillor Ordway's face, which had been beaming with civic pride, seemed to deflate. The proud, rosy tint drained away, leaving a pale, mottled grey. He stared at the mirror as if it had personally insulted him. Mr. Appleby's face was worse. The curator had gone entirely white, his mouth a small, dark O of horror. He looked from the mirror to Councillor Ordway and back again, his expression that of a man who has just realized he has misplaced a priceless national treasure and replaced it with something he won at a fairground hoop toss. Miss Everdine Grimsby, the Society's secretary, seated in the front row, adjusted her formidable hat but did not otherwise move. Her lips, however, pressed themselves into a line so thin it threatened to disappear entirely. From the back of the room, Inspector Pubright watched. He did not smile. He did not frown. He simply observed the subtle yet total collapse of municipal decorum. He noted the way Councillor Ordway's hands clenched into fists and the slight tremor in Mr. Appleby's jaw. The quiet, peculiar crime had not been the appearance of the wrong mirror, he thought. The crime had been the shattering of a perfectly dull and predictable afternoon, and that, in a town like Chalmsbury, was a very serious offence indeed. The silence in the scriptorium did not break. It slowly curdled. It was finally punctured by Mrs. Gable, the Abbey's cleaner, who, with the impeccable timing of the terminally unimpressed, chose that exact moment to rattle the cups for tea at the back of the room. The sound was catastrophically normal. It gave everyone permission to breathe again, to look away from the offensively modern mirror and the two men frozen before it. Councillor Ordway was the first to regain the power of speech, though not of sense.
Well, clearly.
A temporary exhibit, he announced, his voice a hollow echo of its former boom. A placeholder for
conservation purposes. Yes, conservation. He did not look at Mr. Appleby, who seemed to have shrunk inside his tweed jacket. Meeting adjourned, Ordway snapped, before turning on his heel and marching from the room with the air of a man who intended to write a very strongly worded letter to the Times.
Or possibly to Time itself. The 17 members of the society, sensing that the promise of Battenberg cake was now the best they could hope for, shuffled towards the tea urn with a collective,
murmurous sigh. Mr. Appleby, meanwhile, simply vanished.
One moment he was a statue of despair. The next, he was gone, leaving only the purple velvet cloth pooled at the foot of the trestle table like a royal puddle. By 10 o'clock the next morning, the story had escaped the Abbey's stone walls and was reproducing with alarming speed in the fertile environment of Chalmsbury's social ecosystem. In the Tudor tea shop, where the clink of spoons against porcelain was the town's daily metronome, the incident was served up with the morning coffee cake. "A fake, my dear," Beatrice Plumley was saying, her voice a conspiratorial whisper that carried to every corner of the room. Apparently it was made of plastic. Horace Ordway pulled the cloth off and there it was, common as muck. Poor Alistair Appleby nearly fainted on the spot. "Plastic?" gasped her companion Mildred Frobisher.
"From the Aztecs."
"Well, that's the point, isn't it?" said Beatrice, leaning in.
"It's been stolen, swapped."
"Sometime between arriving from the auction house and yesterday's meeting. They say the real one is worth a fortune."
"Cursed too, probably." At that moment, a waitress, startled by a wasp, dropped a tray.
The shattering of a willow-patterned cup and saucer cut through the chatter. Every head turned. It was a sound that seemed to perfectly encapsulate the feeling of the day, a small, irreparable breakage in the established order of things. By lunchtime, the narrative had solidified. It was no longer an embarrassment. It was a crime. At the Grapes Inn, the talk over pints of bitter was less sympathetic. "Ordway," grumbled Mr. Digby, the ironmonger, wiping foam from his moustache. "That's the root of it.
Man's all wind and waistcoat.
Wants his name on a plaque, so he rushes the whole business. Never checks a thing. Leaves poor Appleby to carry the can while some London spiv makes off with the real McCoy." "I heard," offered a voice from the corner, "that Appleby sold it himself. Got gambling debts, Appleby?"
Scoffed Mr. Digby. "The man wouldn't gamble on a raffle ticket if it was the only one in the drum."
"No, this has professional written all over it. Too clever by half." The subject of this speculation, Mr. Alistair Appleby, was at home, sitting in a wing-back chair and staring at a blank wall. He had not answered the telephone all morning. He felt a profound, chilling kinship with the blankness of the wall. It was a state to which he aspired. Councillor Ordway, meanwhile, was in his office at the town hall, radiating an aura of impotent fury that caused the junior clerks to find urgent business in the filing room. To him, the crime was not the loss of the mirror, but the calamitous loss of face. He had been made to look a fool, and in the small, reflective world of local politics, that was a capital offence. The story was now public property. It belonged to everyone, and everyone had a slightly different version, each polished with its own unique patina of suspicion and self-importance. A valuable artifact, a bungling curator, a pompous counsellor, and a mysterious thief. The tale was too good to be wasted on mere facts. It required an official response. It required, as the editor of the Chalmsbury Clarion was at that very moment typing with 2 fingers, a proper police investigation, Inspector Pubright, reading a report on a stolen bicycle from Market Street, heard the rumours arrive at the station with the civilian clerk who brought in the mid-morning tea. He listened patiently, his expression betraying nothing. The bicycle, he suspected, would be found behind the cinema. The mirror, however, was another matter. It was no longer just a piece of glass. It was an object that had begun to warp the very town around it, reflecting back every vanity, grudge, and quiet absurdity. It was becoming, he thought, a case of considerable local importance. By the following afternoon, public opinion had hardened into a fact, and the chief constable, a man who disliked facts but detested public opinion even more,
had a brief, weary telephone call with Inspector Pubright.
The result was that Pubright, accompanied by the reassuringly solid presence of Detective Sergeant Love, found himself once again crunching across the gravel drive of Haldermoor Abbey. The building seemed to have withdrawn into itself, its grey stone facade looking pinched and disapproving under a sky the colour of dishwater. They found Mr. Appleby in his small, cluttered office, which smelled of old leather and despair. The curator looked as if he hadn't slept. He was tidying a stack of perfectly tidy papers, a sure sign of a man on the edge of intellectual collapse. "Inspector, thank you for coming," he said, his voice thin. "Dreadful business. Simply dreadful. If you could just walk us through the mirror's arrival, Mr. Appleby," Pubright said gently, taking a seat. "From the beginning? Of course. It arrived 3 weeks ago. From Sotheby's, delivered by a special courier, properly crated.
I signed for it myself." He produced a docket from a folder with a trembling hand.
"I uncrated it in here with Miss Grimsby present, to check for damage."
It was this magnificent.
"The real one, I mean."
It had a sort of depth to it. It felt
"Old. And after you checked it? Into the strong room immediately. We are very particular about new acquisitions." Mr. Appleby's voice held a note of frayed pride. "It is climate-controlled, fireproof. The key is unique. I keep it on my person at all times." He patted his waistcoat pocket, a gesture that was meant to be reassuring but came across as frantic. "And no one else has access?" Sergeant Love asked, his pencil poised over his notebook. "No one. The lock was changed 2 years ago. There is only the one key." The office door opened, without the courtesy of a knock. Councillor Ordway filled the doorway, bringing with him a gust of municipal indignation. "Inspector,
I thought I'd find you here."
"Getting to the bottom of this disgraceful affair, I trust." "We're just establishing a timeline, Councillor," Pubright said evenly. "Timeline is simple," Ordway declared, striding in and commandeering the only other chair. "Item arrives, item is placed in secure storage, item is then swapped for a piece of cheap tat by a person or persons unknown. The question, Inspector, is one of negligence. How was this allowed to happen on corporation property?" He fixed Mr. Appleby with a hard stare. The curator seemed to wilt further. Pubright let the silence hang for a moment before turning to the curator. "Perhaps, Mr. Appleby, you could ask Miss Grimsby to join us, and maybe we could trouble her for some tea." The request seemed to restore a sliver of normalcy. Appleby nodded gratefully and scurried out. Ordway leaned forward. "Between ourselves, Inspector, Alastair is a good man."
A fine historian.
"But details,
Practicalities?
not his strong suit. A stickler for rules, but perhaps not for a rogue element. You'll want to look at his staff, volunteers, anyone with a grudge." The door opened again, and Miss Evaden Grimsby entered, carrying a tray with 3 cups, a pot of tea, and a plate of digestive biscuits. She moved with a quiet efficiency that made the two men in the room seem clumsy and oversized. She placed the tray on the corner of the desk, poured 3 cups without spilling a drop, and stood waiting, her hands clasped. "Miss Grimsby," Pubright began, after taking a polite sip. "You were present when the mirror was unpacked?"
"I was," she said.
Her voice was clear and cool. It was exactly as Mr. Appleby described it. The obsidian was not flat. It was slightly convex, and when you looked into it, the reflection was distorted, as if you were seeing yourself through dark water. "An excellent description," Pubright murmured. "Did you notice anything unusual in the days leading up to the meeting?" "Councillor Ordway insisted on a new velvet cover for the unveiling," she said, her gaze neutral. "He felt the old one was too dusty. He purchased it himself," Ordway huffed.
"Presentation, Inspector."
"These things matter. Can't have the town's heritage unveiled from under a threadbare rag." "And you, Mr. Appleby," Pubright continued, turning his attention back to the curator, who had returned with Miss Grimsby. "When did you retrieve the mirror for the meeting?" "An hour beforehand. I unlocked the strong room, took it out, and placed it on the trestle table myself. I put the new cover over it immediately, and the strong room was locked when you got there?"
"Of course, exactly as I had left it. So the only time the mirror was out of the strong room was that 1 hour when it was on the table under a cloth in a room that was presumably empty until the members arrived."
"That's correct," said Appleby, his face a mask of miserable confusion. Pubright finished his tea and placed the cup carefully back in its saucer. He had been given 3 entirely different perspectives on the same event. Mr. Appleby had presented a puzzle of logistics, a failure of locks and keys. Councillor Ordway had described a crisis of reputation, a matter of public embarrassment that required a swift culprit. And Miss Grimsby, with her precise memory of distorted reflections and new velvet, had offered something else entirely. She had offered facts unadorned by panic or pride. "Thank you all for your time," Pubright said, rising. "Sergeant Love and I have a few more people to see." As they walked back towards the car, Love clicked his pen shut. "Seems straightforward enough, sir. Someone got a copy of Appleby's key." "It does seem the most logical conclusion, Sergeant," Pubright replied, his gaze still on the Abbey's stern facade. "Logic, however, so rarely accounts for a man's desire to buy a new piece of velvet." Sergeant Love, a man who appreciated the tidiness of a clear motive, had spent a productive hour on the telephone. By the time Inspector Pubright had finished a meditative cup of coffee back at the station, Love had a name, an address, and a grievance. "Reginald Finch," he announced, tapping a freshly typed page. "Volunteer at the Abbey for 10 years. Expert in woodwork restoration, apparently. Mr. Appleby dismissed him 2 months ago." "Dismissed?" Pubright looked up from his paperwork. "That seems a strong word for a volunteer." "Appleby's word, sir. According to Miss Grimsby, who is much clearer on the matter, Mr. Finch took it upon himself to polish a Jacobean coffer with his own beeswax and turpentine mixture, against explicit curatorial instructions. Appleby called it unwarranted chemical intervention. Finch, it seems, called it common sense. Voices were raised. An ultimatum was issued. Finch packed up his polishing cloths and left, vowing that Appleby would rue the day he put his faith in academic nincompoops. "A man of strong convictions," Pubright noted. "He's got the motive, sir," Love said, with satisfaction. Humiliating Appleby and Ordway in one go would be right up his street.
"And he knows the Abbey like the back of his hand."
Every nook and cranny. Mr. Finch lived in a small, pre-war bungalow named the Laurels, though there were no laurels in sight, only a fiercely disciplined row of standard roses. The man who answered the door was as neat as his garden, a short, wiry man with a sharp nose and spectacles that sat perched with architectural precision. "I've been expecting you," he said, before Pubright could even introduce himself. He showed them into a living room that was less a room than a museum of personal obsessions. Glass cabinets displayed collections of military cap badges, seashells sorted by size, and an unnerving number of antique corkscrews. "There was no dust. You've spoken to Appleby," Finch stated, sitting bolt upright in a wingback chair.
"He'll have told you I'm a vandal and a menace."
"The man is a fool. He reads books, but he doesn't understand things. He wouldn't know oak from pine if it fell on his head." "We were told there was a disagreement," Pubright said placidly. "A disagreement?" Finch sniffed, a sound like a file on metal. "I was preserving a priceless piece of English heritage from the damp. He accused me of destroying its patina."
"It's patina."
"The man worships dust, Inspector. He's a high priest of decay." The venom in his voice was genuine and deeply felt. "So you're not fond of Mr. Appleby?" Sergeant Love interjected, stating the obvious with relish. "I consider him a menace to history," Finch corrected. "As for that mirror business, it serves him right. Parading some heathen idol around when there are Tudor chests crying out for a decent waxing. It's an act of sublime incompetence."
"I couldn't have planned it better myself. Did you?"
Love asked bluntly. Mr. Finch fixed him with a glittering stare. "Do I look like a common thief, Sergeant?"
"I am a craftsman."
"If I wanted to embarrass Alistair Appleby, I would write a letter to the antiquarian's journal detailing his catastrophic ignorance of woodworm."
"I would not stoop to pantomime tricks with cheap mirrors." His pride was palpable.
The idea of such a crude prank seemed to offend him more than the accusation itself. "Where were you on the afternoon of the society meeting, Mr. Finch?" Pubright asked quietly. "I was here, in this room. I was remounting my collection of regimental buttons from the Peninsular War, a task requiring intense concentration and a steady hand. My neighbour may have seen my light on." Pubright looked around the obsessively ordered room. It was a perfect self-contained world. Its owner seemed far more interested in the small wars of the past than in the petty skirmishes of the present. As they left, Sergeant Love was ticking mental boxes. Motive, opportunity, weak alibi. He's so puffed up with pride he'd never admit it. "He's our man, sir." "He is certainly a man with a grievance," Pubright agreed as he got into the car. He practically confessed.
"Couldn't have planned it better myself." Yes, he did say that, didn't he?
Pubright started the engine. It's an interesting choice of words. He sees the event as a piece of craftsmanship, and he clearly feels it's of a rather poor standard. He paused, turning the car onto the main road. "A man like Mr. Finch, Sergeant, if he were to create a replica of something—"
"I have a feeling he would have done a much
better job." Sergeant Love, dutiful if unconvinced, went off to check Mr. Finch's alibi, a task Pubright knew would involve a fruitless conversation with a neighbour who tended to her garden at very specific times. The inspector, meanwhile, found his thoughts drifting away from disgruntled volunteers and returning with a quiet insistence to a roll of purple velvet. It was an absurdly trivial detail on which to hang an investigation, but Pubright had always found that trivialities were where the truth liked to hide. The grand motives and dramatic gestures were usually for show. He took a walk down Chalmsbury's High Street, pausing outside Thornton's Drapery and Sons, a shop that had looked exactly the same since the invention of the loom. Inside, amidst bolts of chintz and towers of knitting wool, Mr. Thornton himself was measuring out a length of ribbon. He was a man whose professional opinion on fabrics was held in higher esteem locally than the pronouncements of the Meteorological Office. "Inspector," he said, peering over his half-moon glasses.
"Not often we see you in here."
"Trouble with your curtains?" "A small query, Mr. Thornton," Pubright said, his eyes scanning the shelves. "I believe Councillor Ordway made a purchase here recently." "A length of purple velvet," Mr. Thornton's expression brightened.
"Ah yes, the councillor's velvet."
"A fine choice. Panna velvet, deep pile. Very luxurious. Very heavy." He stroked an imaginary piece of cloth in the air. He was the most particular.
"I want something with weight, Thornton," he said.
"Something with a sense of occasion." "He was using it for an unveiling up at the Abbey, he told me." "A great honour for the town. And you sold it to him last week?" "Tuesday morning. Paid in cash from the mayoral fund. Said the existing cloth was a disgrace. Thin as a pauper's blanket, were his words. Mr. Thornton leaned forward. Between you and me, Inspector, the old one was perfectly good felt, serviceable, but it didn't have...
Well, it didn't have what the councillor wanted. And what was that?
Pubright asked. Pomp, said Mr. Thornton with the finality of an expert. Pubright thanked him and left. So, Ordway had replaced a perfectly serviceable cloth with an expensive, heavy theatrical one. An act of pure vanity, it seemed.
And yet it felt like more than that.
It was an unnecessary action, and unnecessary actions always interested the inspector. They were clues not to the crime, but to the character of the people involved. Back in his office, he telephoned Miss Grimsby. My apologies for disturbing you again, Miss Grimsby. A small point of clarification. The donor of the mirror, Major Hemlock. You knew him well? There was a pause on the line. I was the Society's secretary for the last 15 years of his life, Inspector. One could not help but know the Major. He was a frequent and frequently challenging presence. Challenging in what way? The Major, she said, her voice dry as a pressed flower, believed that pomposity was a sickness that required a regular and vigorous cure.
He enjoyed engineering situations.
He once sent a perfectly forged invitation to the mayor of our rival town, inviting him to a ceremony where he was to be granted the freedom of Chalmsbury. The ensuing confusion at the town hall was, I believe, a source of great satisfaction to him. A practical joker, then? I would not use such a trivial term, Inspector. The Major's jokes always had a point. They were designed to see what people were made of. He liked to say that you find out more about a man by his reaction to a dropped teacup than to a declaration of war. Pubright felt a faint but distinct click in the machinery of his thoughts. A man who designed tests, a man who despised pomposity, a man who bequeathed a priceless artifact to be unveiled by the most pompous man in town. He thanked Miss Grimsby and hung up the phone. He looked out of his window at the slow, unchanging procession of life on Chalmsbury's streets. The mystery of the mirror, he was beginning to suspect, had very little to do with the object itself. It had to do with its absence. An absence created perhaps not by a thief in the night, but by a dead man's intricate, posthumous sense of humour. And the new, heavy, opulent velvet cloth was no longer an irrelevance. It was, Pubright suspected, the curtain for the play. If the late Major Hemlock had designed his final prank as a test of character, it seemed only right to Pubright that he should learn more about the characters the Major had left behind. A quick look at the probate records revealed a sole beneficiary beyond the historical society, a nephew, Mr. Julian Hemlock, whose address was a gallery in one of the more elegant Georgian streets of Lincoln. The gallery, when Pubright found it, was a place of minimalist severity. A single, brutally abstract sculpture stood on a white plinth, and the air was chilled to a temperature designed to discourage idle browsing. Mr. Julian Hemlock matched his surroundings. He was a tall, slender man in a grey suit of architectural precision, and he regarded Pubright's warrant card with the weary distaste of one examining a poorly executed forgery. "Inspector," he said, his voice as cool and polished as the floor. "I assume this is about my uncle's ridiculous looking glass. Has the Chalmsbury police force misplaced it already? That must be a new record, even for them." "There is some confusion as to its whereabouts," Pubright said mildly. "You are aware of its value?" A thin, humourless smile touched Julian Hemlock's lips.
"I am an art dealer, Inspector. I was the one who had it valued for probate."
"Depending on the market, somewhere between £50,000 and £70,000. He let the figure hang in the air. An absurd sum for a piece of polished volcanic rock, but the provenance was impeccable. I had a collector in Zurich who would have taken it without a second thought. Instead, my uncle, in his infinite and senile wisdom, gave it to a committee of damp-fearing amateurs to be gawped at by school children. You and your uncle were not close? My uncle considered the pursuit of profit to be a moral failing, second only to wearing brown shoes in town, I consider the hoarding of beautiful, valuable objects in dusty provincial museums to be a crime against aesthetics.
We agreed to disagree largely by not speaking for the last 5 years of his life. He paused, picking an invisible piece of lint from his sleeve.
He believed things should go where they would be appreciated, not where they would be valued. The man was a sentimentalist to the last. Pubright noted the distinction. Did it surprise you that he gave it to the society? Nothing my uncle did surprised me. He was a creature of elaborate, tedious whimsy. Giving that mirror to the likes of Horace Ordway was entirely in character. It was like leaving a starving man a locked safe containing a single, perfect olive. He would have relished the thought of them not knowing quite what to do with it. Do you have any idea who might want to steal it? Pubright asked. Julian Hemlock gave a short, dry laugh.
Steal it?
My dear Inspector, anyone with an ounce of sense. Find someone in Chalmsbury who suddenly seems less parochial than they were last week. That will be your thief. The dismissal was total. He had provided the monetary motive, but clearly believed no one in Chalmsbury would possess the necessary sophistication to act on it. Pubright left the chilly gallery and drove back to the familiar, cluttered embrace of Chalmsbury. The nephew's cynicism had been bracing, but it was a dead end. Julian Hemlock saw the world in terms of price tags and provenances. The affair of the mirror felt altogether more personal. His thoughts returned to the Abbey, to the small stage where the drama had unfolded. He found Mrs. Gable in the nave, waging her unending war against entropy with a dustpan and brush. She moved with a slow, rhythmic economy of motion, her work punctuated by the soft scrape of bristles on stone. "Afternoon, Inspector," she said, not looking up.
Come about the mirror, have you?
More fuss over that than when the heating boiler exploded.
At least that made a proper mess. I was hoping you might have noticed something, Mrs. Gable. In the days before the meeting. She stopped sweeping and leaned on her brush, her expression thoughtful.
Funny thing, notice.
People like me were not meant to.
We're meant to be part of the furniture. But you see things, he knows what sort of things. Well, she said, gathering her thoughts, I saw Mr. Appleby the morning of that meeting. He was in his office, just staring at the wall.
White as a sheet he was.
Jumpy as a cat.
And that was hours before the...
Whatever it was. He was nervous? Nervous doesn't cover it. He looked like a man who'd been told the roof was about to fall in, but he wasn't allowed to tell anyone. Pubright filed this away. Appleby's anxiety had begun long before the unveiling.
And Councillor Ordway?
Mrs. Gable gave a low chuckle.
Oh, he was in his element, strutting about.
Brought in that new purple cloth himself, he did.
In a fancy bag from Thornton's, handled it like it was the crown jewels. She shook her head. But he didn't put it on the table, he didn't?
No, he left it all folded up on the curator's desk. Said to Mr. Appleby, "See, this is taken care of," bossing him about as usual. She resumed her sweeping for a moment, then stopped again. It was Miss Grimsby who sorted it. About an hour before the meeting,
I was polishing the brasses in the vestibule. I saw her go in the scriptorium.
She took the cloth, shook it out proper, it was heavy, that thing, and laid it over the table herself. Very particular she was. Smoothing it down, making sure it hung just so, Pubright stood quite still. It was nothing. It was a helpful secretary performing a simple task that her flustered superior had forgotten. And yet, Miss Grimsby, the quiet, efficient observer, had not merely observed. She had taken an active part. She had smoothed down the curtain. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," Pubright said. "You've been very helpful. I just sweep the floors."
"Inspector," she replied, but her eyes, sharp and knowing,
suggested she was well aware that that was where all the most interesting dirt was to be found. The following morning dawned grey and uneventful. At the Chalmsbury police station, the daily rhythm asserted itself with the gentle hiss of the radiator and the methodical clatter of a typewriter from the front office. Inspector Pubright was engaged in a close study of a report concerning the theft of 3 prize-winning leeks from an allotment, a crime that had generated a surprising amount of vitriol and very few clues. It was, he felt, a case that was reassuringly rooted in the soil of human nature. It was Sergeant Love who brought the parcel in. "For you, sir. Just came in the morning post." It was a small, square box, no bigger than a pack of playing cards, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. The address, written in a neat, slightly old-fashioned copperplate script, read simply, "The Inspector, Police Station, Chalmsbury." There was no sender's name. The postage had been paid with a tidy row of stamps bearing the Queen's head. Pubright looked at it for a moment, then took the penknife from his desk drawer and carefully slit the string and the paper. Inside was a cardboard box, and inside that, nestled in a bed of white cotton wool, lay a single, dark object. It was a button. It was about the size of a penny, perfectly round, and made of what was unmistakably polished black obsidian. It was not a flat, modern button, but convex, like the lens of an old camera. It had 2 small holes drilled neatly through the center for thread. The surface was cool and smooth to the touch, and as Pubright held it up to the weak light from the window, it did not merely reflect his face but seemed to absorb the light, drawing his reflection down into its dark, watery depths. It was, in miniature, an exact echo of the description Miss Grimsby had given of the real mirror. Sergeant Love stared at it. "Well, I'll be," he breathed. "What on earth is that supposed to be?
A souvenir?" "I don't think so, Sergeant," Pubright said softly, turning the object over in his palm.
It had a surprising weight for its size. "It's a taunt, then," Love concluded, his brow furrowing. "Our man, Finch, or whoever, is playing games, letting us know he's got the mirror and we can't touch him." Pubright continued to study the button, his expression unreadable. A taunt felt wrong. A taunt was an act of ego, of bravado. This felt different. It was quiet, deliberate, almost polite. It was not a challenge. It was a piece of information. The package had not been sent to mock them, but to inform them. To tell them something. He thought of the mirror's value. 50, perhaps £70,000. A professional thief would not damage the goods. He would sell it quickly and quietly to a collector in Zurich. He would not linger to post pieces of his loot to the local police.
And a vengeful amateur like Mr. Finch?
It seemed an oddly subtle form of revenge. Why not send a photograph of the mirror in a new setting? Why send a small, discreet, and rather beautiful button? "Check the packaging for print, Sergeant," Pubright said, his voice bringing Love back to the world of procedure. "Check the postmark on the stamps. See if you can trace the box." He knew, even as he said it, that the sender would have been too careful for any of that. The neat copperplate script, the plain paper, the cotton wool, it was all part of a meticulous and thoughtful process. "Right away, sir." Love took the packaging, leaving Pubright alone with the button. The inspector placed it carefully on his green desk blotter. The small, dark disc seemed to absorb the room's ambient anxiety. It proved the real mirror still existed and was, presumably, somewhere nearby. More than that, it proved that its possessor was not a common criminal. The person who had sent this was not motivated by greed, nor, he suspected, by simple malice. They were motivated by something altogether more complex. This was a piece of the puzzle deliberately and carefully delivered into his hands. It was an invitation to think, to look beyond the obvious narrative of theft. It was, Pubright suspected, another move in a game devised by a dead man, now being played by a very careful, very quiet, and possibly very frightened living one. The question was no longer simply who had taken the mirror, but who was now trying in this cryptic and peculiar way to help him understand why. The Chalmsbury police station emptied as the afternoon wore on, leaving Inspector Pubright in the quiet company of his thoughts and the small dark object on his desk. The report on the stolen leeks lay resolved in his out tray. The culprit, a rival gardener, had confessed after a brief and withering interview. That had been a crime of passion, simple and earthy. The matter of the obsidian mirror was something else entirely. Pubright picked up the button. It felt cool and heavy in his hand, a small, solid fact in a case built of smoke and embarrassment. Its physical weight was negligible, but its conceptual weight was immense. It was a piece of an object valued at £70,000, yet it had been sent through the post with the casual anonymity of a leaflet. The act was a direct contradiction of the mirror's monetary value. It was a statement, and the statement was that money was not the point. So, he wondered, what was the point? He let his mind drift over the people caught in the mirror's strange orbit, each of them valuing it in a completely different way. For Julian Hemlock, it was a commodity, a number in a ledger. Its value was its price. For Councillor Ordway, it was a prop, a tool for the inflation of his own importance. Its value was in the reflected glory it could cast upon him. For the terrified Mr. Appleby, the mirror was a sacred burden. Its value was in its safekeeping, and its loss represented the collapse of his professional soul. Even for Mr. Finch, the mirror had a value of sorts. It was a negative value, a symbol of the modern frippery he so despised. And for the man who started it all, Major Hemlock, Pubright mused, had clearly held another scale of values altogether. A man who engineered elaborate pranks to puncture pomposity was not a man who cared for price tags or public acclaim. His currency was character. He valued humility, wit, and a sense of proportion. He dealt not in objects, but in reactions. The mirror, then, was not a bequest in the normal sense. It was a catalyst. It was a question asked from beyond the grave. Pubright leaned back in his chair. If the Major had set a test, who was the student? Ordway, almost certainly.
Appleby, perhaps.
But they were merely the actors on the stage. Who was the stage manager? His thoughts settled, as they had done before, on the quiet, unobtrusive figure of Miss Evaden Grimsby. She had known the Major for 15 years. She understood his challenging nature. She had, with her own hands, laid the heavy velvet cloth that had been so crucial to the calamitous reveal. She had watched the proceedings with an unnervingly calm eye.
Of all of them, she was the only one whose motives remained entirely opaque. The button on his desk was not a taunt from a thief.
It was a signal from a co-conspirator. Or if not a co-conspirator, then at least from someone who knew the rules of the Major's game. It was the act of someone who had expected the affair to be a brief, contained humiliation for Councillor Ordway, a 9-day wonder for the town gossips. But it had escalated. The police had been called. The talk was of a major theft, of insurance claims and criminal charges. The joke had grown teeth. Someone, Pubright felt sure, was now frightened. Someone was trying to guide him towards a less troublesome truth without having to confess their own part in the deception. He looked at the button one last time. It was an invitation to solve the right puzzle. The puzzle was not who stole the mirror, but what was the point of the performance? And to understand a performance, one sometimes had to gather the actors and watch them on stage one more time. It was time, he decided, to stop reflecting and to start arranging a small production of his own. Inspector Purbright's proposed security review was met with the reactions he had anticipated. Councillor Ordway welcomed it as a sign of long overdue action. Telephoning Pubright to offer his own unsolicited and largely unworkable suggestions involving tripwires, Mr. Appleby agreed to the meeting with a tone of profound weariness.
As if being asked to schedule his own execution.
Miss Grimsby, when Pubright called her, simply said, 3 o'clock tomorrow, in the curator's office.
I will ensure everyone is there. She made it sound less like a request and more like an established fact. Thus,
at 3 o'clock the next day, the principal players were once again assembled in Mr. Appleby's office. The room felt smaller than before, crowded with unspoken accusations and the lingering scent of beeswax. Sergeant Love sat in a corner with his notebook open, a silent, stolid representation of official consequence. Pubright began, as promised, with security. He spoke in a calm, measured voice about the advisability of new locks on the west wing windows and the possibility of a modest alarm system connected to the station. An excellent idea.
Inspector, Councillor Ordway boomed, seizing the floor.
I've been saying for years that our heritage is vulnerable. We need a modern approach, something proactive. The society's budget is constrained, Councillor, Mr. Appleby murmured, polishing his spectacles with a piece of chamois leather. The cost of heating alone is ruinous. One cannot put a price on security, Ordway retorted, delivering the line as if it were a great philosophical truth he had just minted. The conversation drifted in this predictable eddy for several minutes. Pubright allowed it to run its course, observing the three of them, Ordway posturing and dominant,
Appleby defensive and shrinking,
Miss Grimsby sitting perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression one of polite neutrality. She contributed nothing to the discussion, but Pubright had the distinct impression that she was listening to a different conversation entirely. When there was a lull, Pubright changed tack. "Of course," he said, his tone becoming slightly more reflective. "No amount of security can prevent a thing from being misplaced from the inside. This whole affair has been most peculiar." He reached slowly into his waistcoat pocket. "In fact, we had a new development only yesterday." He drew out the small obsidian button and, without any particular emphasis, placed it in the center of the large leather-bound visitor's book that lay on the desk. The small, dark object sat on the pale page, commanding the attention of the room. "A parcel arrived for me," he said, conversationally. This was inside. The effect was instantaneous and threefold. Councillor Ordway leaned forward, squinting.
"What is it, a button?"
"Good Lord Inspector, is this what the investigation has come to? Trivialities. What does it mean? Who sent it?
"Have you fingerprinted it?"
His reaction was a barrage of impatient questions, the bluster of a man confronted with a detail he could not immediately place within his own simple narrative. Mr. Appleby flinched. He physically recoiled in his chair as if the button were venomous. His eyes, wide behind his spectacles, darted from the button to Pubright and back again.
Is it from the mirror?"
he stammered, his voice barely a whisper.
"Has it been smashed?"
The thought was clearly a new and exquisite form of torture for him. His was a reaction of pure, uncomprehending fear. Miss Grimsby did not move. She did not gasp or lean forward. But for the briefest fraction of a second, her composure fractured. It was a change visible only to a man who was looking for it. A sudden, absolute stillness, a brief cessation of breathing. Her eyes, fixed on the button, not with surprise, but with the flat, hard shock of recognition. It was the look of a chess player who sees their opponent make an unexpected and brilliant move. She recovered almost instantly, her expression smoothing back into its customary reserve, but Pubright had seen it. He did not acknowledge her reaction directly. Instead, he picked up the button again, holding it between his thumb and forefinger.
"It has a certain quality, doesn't it?"
he mused, looking at it thoughtfully. "It reminds one of the late Major Hemlock's particular sense of humor." He shifted his gaze slowly from the button to Miss Grimsby. "You told me, Miss Grimsby, that he enjoyed setting little tests for people, designing situations to see what they were made of. This feels rather like one of his little clues, don't you think?" His voice was gentle, almost collaborative, but the question hung in the silent room with the weight of a formal accusation. Councillor Ordway looked from Pubright to Miss Grimsby, his mouth half open, utterly baffled. Mr. Appleby simply looked terrified, lost in a drama whose script he had never been given. Miss Grimsby met Purbright's gaze. Her own was steady, her face a polite, unrevealing mask. "The Major's mind was far too complex for me to presume to know what he would or would not do, Inspector," she said, her voice perfectly even. "Of course," Pubright said, pocketing the button. He stood up. "Well, thank you all for your time. You've given me a great deal to think about." The meeting dissolved in a fog of confusion and unease. Ordway left, still muttering about fingerprints and wasting police time.
Appleby looked as if he might faint.
Miss Grimsby gathered her notepad and departed with quiet dignity. When they were alone, Sergeant Love finally spoke.
"I don't get it, sir. She barely batted an eyelid, didn't she, Sergeant?"
Pubright said, looking out the window as Miss Grimsby's upright figure crossed the gravel drive below. Some people, when they are frightened, they scream. Others, you will find, simply hold their breath. As the sound of Councillor Ordway's indignant footsteps faded down the stone corridor, Inspector Pubright turned back to the two people remaining in the office. Mr. Appleby was slumped in his chair, looking utterly defeated. Miss Grimsby stood by the desk, her handbag held firmly in front of her, a bastion of composure in a room thick with unresolved tension. "Please, don't go just yet," Pubright said quietly. "There's a final matter to discuss. Perhaps you should sit down, Miss Grimsby." For the first time, she looked hesitant, but she moved to the chair vacated by the councillor and sat, her back perfectly straight. Pubright did not return to his own seat. He stood by the window looking out at the Abbey's peaceful grounds. "This was never going to be a simple case," he began, his voice calm and conversational. "It had none of the hallmarks of a genuine theft. No forced entry, no broken locks, no sign of a professional criminal. A professional would have known the mirror's value and would be halfway to Zurich by now. An amateur like Mr. Finch would have been clumsy or boastful. This was something else. This was neat, precise, and theatrical." He turned from the window to face them. "I do not believe the Obsidian mirror was ever stolen from this abbey, Mr. Appleby. I believe it was never here in the first place." Mr. Appleby stared at him, his mouth agape. "Not here?"
"But, Inspector, I saw it. I unpacked it myself."
"Did you?" Pubright asked gently. "Or did you unpack an object that looked to a quick and trusting eye very much like it? An object sent by a man with a legendary reputation for elaborate jokes. A man who despised pomposity above all things." He let his gaze rest on Miss Grimsby. "Major Hemlock planned the whole affair. It was his last and greatest practical joke. He knew Councillor Ordway's vanity would demand a grand public unveiling. He knew Mr. Appleby's meticulous nature would ensure the object was kept under lock and key, unexamined until the great day. So he bequeathed to the society not the real mirror, but the excellent modern replica that we all saw at the meeting. He set the stage for a perfect moment of public deflation, a pinprick to the balloon of civic pride. It was his final lesson. Mr. Appleby's face was a study in dawning comprehension. A replica? From the start?
From the very start, Pubright confirmed.
But a plan like that requires an accomplice, a trusted friend on the inside to ensure the arrangements went smoothly, someone to manage things after he was gone, someone who knew his character and would be loyal to his final wishes. He looked directly at Miss Grimsby now. "The Major confided in you, didn't he? He told you his plan. He entrusted you to see it through. Your only role was to stand back and allow events to unfold."
"And you did."
"You watched Mr. Appleby secure the replica. You watched Councillor Ordway purchase a ridiculously opulent new cloth for the unveiling. You even, when it seemed Mr. Appleby was too flustered to manage it, put the cloth on the table yourself, ensuring the stage was perfectly set." He paused. Miss Grimsby said nothing. Her face was pale, but her expression was steady. "The plan, however, had a flaw," Pubright continued. "The Major, for all his insight into human nature, underestimated the sheer depth of Councillor Ordway's ego. He expected Ordway to be embarrassed, perhaps to bluster for a day or two before the affair became a town joke. He did not anticipate that the councillor, to save his own face, would invent a narrative of a clever theft, thereby forcing a full police investigation. The joke was no longer funny. It was a serious criminal matter. You were in an impossible position. You couldn't reveal the truth without betraying the Major's confidence and causing an even greater scandal.
"So you panicked."
Pubright took the obsidian button from his pocket and placed it on the desk, just as he had done before.
"You sent me this."
The Major must have given it to you, a keepsake perhaps." It was a silent message, a clue to tell me that the mirror wasn't stolen or destroyed, and that I should be looking for a different kind of explanation. It was a very clever and a very desperate thing to do. He fell silent. The only sound in the room was the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. Mr. Appleby looked at Miss Grimsby, his expression no longer fearful, but filled with a kind of wounded amazement. Finally, Miss Grimsby spoke. Her voice was low but clear. "He called it Operation Puncture," she said. "He thought it was hilarious. He said Horace Ordway had been floating on a cloud of his own hot air for 20 years, and it was time someone brought him back to earth. It was a confession, quiet, dignified, and utterly complete. He was very fond of you, Alistair," she said, turning to the curator. "He knew you would be distressed, and he regretted that. But he said you were a good man who was allowing himself to be bullied by a fool, and that sometimes a small shock is necessary to wake one up." "And the real mirror?"
Pubright asked. "It is in my flat."
"In a hat box in the bottom of my wardrobe," she said, with a faint, wry smile. The Major's instructions were that I was to wait a year and then anonymously donate it to a small, underfunded museum in a town that didn't have a Horace Ordway on its council. He left me a list of suitable candidates. Mr. Appleby let out a long, slow breath. It was the sound of a burden he had been carrying for weeks finally being set down. He looked not angry, but profoundly, immeasurably relieved. "So," Pubright said, his tone practical now, "we have a replica mirror that belongs to the Society."
"And we have a real mirror that is in transit, so to speak, to its intended home."
"We have a great deal of wasted police time."
"But we have no theft." He looked at Miss Grimsby.
"The Major has had his last laugh. I think under the circumstances we can consider this matter closed. The official explanation when it came was a masterpiece of municipal obfuscation. A short, dryly worded article appeared on the third page of the Chalmsbury Clarion, nestled between a notice about an upcoming jumble sale and a letter complaining about pigeons. It stated that the unfortunate misunderstanding at Haldermoor Abbey had been resolved. The object unveiled had been a temporary security replica placed on display due to an internal communications error, while the genuine artifact was undergoing final authentication by experts. The police investigation, it concluded, had found no evidence of criminal activity, and the matter was now closed. Councillor Horace Ordway naturally claimed the entire affair as a personal triumph. "It is precisely because I insisted on a thorough and robust police presence," he told a reporter from the Clarion, who had cornered him outside the butcher's, "that this matter was brought to such a swift and satisfactory conclusion. It proves that our systems, while perhaps in need of a little fine-tuning by myself, are fundamentally sound."
"A victory for civic diligence, Chalmsbury."
Which had long ago learned to translate Ordway's speeches as one might translate a foreign language, understood that his face had been saved, and moved on. At Haldermoor Abbey, a quiet but profound change had taken place. Mr. Alistair Appleby, having been taken to the edge of a professional abyss and looked into its depths, had come back strangely fortified. The permanent state of low-level anxiety in which he had lived for years had been replaced by a quiet, stoical calm. When Councillor Ordway next tried to lecture him on the proper cataloguing of donated photographs, Mr. Appleby simply looked at him over the top of his spectacles and said, "Thank you, Councillor, but I have the matter entirely in hand," before turning back to his work. It was a statement of such unprecedented finality that Ordway was stunned into a rare and momentary silence. Miss Evaden Grimsby continued her duties with the same impeccable efficiency as always. She and Inspector Pubright occasionally passed one another on the high street. They would exchange a brief, polite nod. It was a nod of no particular significance to any onlookers, but it contained within it a shared and unspoken understanding of Major Hemlock's complex legacy, of a well-managed secret, and of a joke that had landed precisely as its creator had intended. In the bottom of her wardrobe, a hat box containing an object of immense value and historical importance waited patiently for a suitable journey. The gossip in the Tudor tea shop, having exhausted the possibilities of the mirror, moved on to the far more scandalous business of the prize-winning leaks. The affair of the Obsidian mirror was relegated to the status of a local anecdote, a funny story about the time Horace Ordway got his comeuppance. The truth, in all its quiet and intricate glory, remained the property of 3 people. Back at the station, Inspector Pubright sat at his desk, typing the last lines of his final report. Sergeant Love stood by looking at the file. "So what should I put for the official resolution, sir?"
he asked. "Closed due to—"
Pubright paused, his fingers hovering over the keys. He looked out of the window at the slow, predictable rhythm of life in Chalmsbury. A delivery van was blocking the road. 2 women were chatting by the postbox. A dog was hopefully watching the door of the baker's shop. Everything was precisely as it should be. He turned back to the typewriter. Under the heading Conclusion, he typed a single, perfectly chosen sentence. Property misdescribed. No further action required. He pulled the sheet from the typewriter, placed it neatly in the file, and stamped it with the satisfyingly chunky word, "Closed." There was a fresh pile of paperwork in his in-tray, waiting. Business as usual.